Now that your husband is gone, you should pack your things and leave. This house isn't yours anymore." My daughter-in-law said it so calmly, like she was asking me to pass the salt at dinner. My son didn't even look at me when she spoke. He just kept his eyes on his plate, nodding slightly, as if this had already been decided long before I walked into that room. I remember standing there, my hand still resting on the back of the chair my husband used to sit in, feeling as though the air had shifted without warning. It had only been 5 days since we buried him. 5 days since I stood beside his casket, holding on to what was left of my world, telling myself that at least I still had a family. I was 71 years old, and in that moment, I realized I was completely alone. The house felt different that night, colder somehow, even though nothing had physically changed. The same hardwood floors, the same framed photographs lining the walls, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals over 4 decades. But now, every inch of it felt like it belonged to someone else. Or maybe it always had, and I was just now being told the truth. "You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller," Vanessa continued, her tone carrying that same polished politeness she always used when she wanted something. "It's too much for you to manage on your own." I turned to Daniel, waiting, hoping for something, anything, that resembled the boy I had raised. The boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who used to call me when he had a bad day, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. But that boy wasn't sitting at the table anymore. In his place was a man who couldn't meet his mother's eyes. "It makes sense, Mom," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "We've been thinking about this for a while." For a while? The words echoed in my mind, settling into something heavy and irreversible. While I was sitting beside my husband's hospital bed, while I was holding his hand in those final hours, while I was planning his funeral, choosing flowers, writing an obituary that tried to capture a lifetime in a few paragraphs. They had already been planning what to do with me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, the way you do when something is so final, so absolute, that fighting it would only make it worse. "Of course," I said quietly, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I'll start packing in the morning." Vanessa smiled then, a small, satisfied smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel exhaled, as if relieved that I hadn't made things difficult. I went upstairs that night to the bedroom I had shared with my husband for 42 years. His side of the bed was still untouched, the indentation in the pillow exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses rested on the nightstand, next to the book he never got to finish. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the quiet evidence of a life that had been mine just days ago. Then I stood up, opened the closet, and pulled out a suitcase. I packed slowly, carefully, folding each piece of clothing with the same attention I'd given everything in my life. Not because I had to, but because it was the only thing I could control. No one came upstairs to check on me. No one asked if I needed help. Downstairs, I could hear them talking in low voices, the occasional clink of dishes, the ordinary sounds of a house that was already moving on without me. By morning, I was ready. 1 suitcase, 1 handbag, 42 years reduced to what I could carry. I paused at the front door, my hand on the knob, and looked back one last time. Not at the furniture or the walls, but at the life I thought I had. Then I stepped outside without saying goodbye. They thought I had nowhere to go. And for the first time in my life, I let them believe it. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before I realized I had no destination in mind. The road stretched ahead of me, familiar streets turning into unfamiliar ones, the quiet hum of the engine, the only sound filling the silence. For years, I had always known where I was going. Grocery store, church, doctor appointments, back home before sunset. My life had been mapped out in small, predictable routes. But that morning, for the first time, I did not have a place to return to. I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner just off the highway, the kind Robert and I used to stop at during road trips decades ago. The sign flickered slightly in the daylight, and there were only 3 cars parked outside. It felt safe in a way I could not explain. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and toast, warm and ordinary. I chose a booth by the window and set my suitcase beside me, careful not to let it tip over. The waitress approached with a gentle smile, the kind reserved for strangers who looked like they needed a little kindness. "Just coffee, ma'am?" she asked. I nodded. My voice felt too heavy to use. As she walked away, I stared at my reflection in the glass. The woman looking back at me did not seem like someone who had just lost everything. My hair was neatly brushed. My coat was buttoned properly. My hands were steady as they rested on the table. There were no tears, no visible signs of distress. But something deeper had shifted, something that could not be seen from the outside. The coffee arrived, steaming in a simple white mug. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. For a long time, I just sat there, watching people come and go. A young couple sharing pancakes. A man in a work uniform checking his phone between bites. Life moving forward in quiet, ordinary ways, completely untouched by what had just happened to me. It was strange how the world did not pause when yours fell apart. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. There were no missed calls. No messages. Not from Daniel, not from anyone. The silence felt deliberate, as if they had already closed the chapter that included me. I should have been surprised, maybe even hurt. But instead, there was a growing clarity settling in, steady and cold. I thought about the past few months, the small things I had ignored. Vanessa answering questions that were not directed at her. Daniel deferring to her in conversations that used to include me. The way decisions were made around me, not with me. At the time, I had told myself it was normal. That families changed. That I needed to adjust. Now I understood that it had not been a change. It had been a transition. A quiet shift in roles where I was no longer part of the structure. Only a temporary presence waiting to be removed. I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. Robert had always handled our finances. Not because I could not, but because he insisted it was one less thing for me to worry about. Everything is taken care of, he used to say with that calm certainty that made me believe him without question. At the time, those words had felt like comfort. Now, they returned to me with a different weight. Everything is taken care of. I repeated it silently, as if saying it enough times might reveal something I had missed. Robert had never been careless. He had been precise, methodical, always thinking 2 steps ahead. Even in the final weeks, when his strength was fading, his mind had remained sharp. There were moments, small and easy to dismiss, when he had asked questions about Daniel's spending, about Vanessa's plans, about things that had seemed unimportant at the time. But now, sitting alone in that diner with nothing but a suitcase and a cup of coffee, those moments began to rearrange themselves into something else. Something intentional. I set the mug down slowly and reached for my purse again. Inside, tucked between old receipts and a small photograph of Robert, was a folded envelope I had not opened. He had given it to me just a week before he passed, pressing it into my hand with a look I could not quite understand at the time. "Keep this somewhere safe," he had said quietly. I had slipped it into my purse without asking questions. There had been so many things happening then, so many decisions to make, so many emotions to manage. I had not thought much about it since. Until now. My fingers rested on the edge of the envelope, tracing its outline without opening it. Not yet. There was a feeling building inside me. Not panic, not fear, but something steadier. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot, gravel crunching beneath its tires. I watched it for a moment, then looked back down at the envelope in my hands. For the first time since I walked out of that house, I felt like I was not entirely without direction. I just had not seen the path yet. I did not open the envelope right away. Instead, I finished my coffee slowly, as if stretching out those last few moments before everything changed again. The diner had started to fill up, the quiet morning turning into something busier, louder, more alive. Plates clinked against countertops, chairs scraped softly against the floor, and conversations blended into a steady hum. It reminded me of Sunday mornings years ago, when Robert and I would sit across from each other in places just like this, sharing a meal without needing to fill every silence with words. Back then, silence had been comfortable. Now, it felt like a space waiting to be filled with truth. I paid the bill in cash and thanked the waitress, who gave me a small nod as if she understood more than I had said. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, carrying a light breeze that brushed against my face as I walked back to my car. I placed my suitcase in the back seat and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The envelope rested in my lap, its edges slightly worn from being carried around without purpose. I turned it over once, twice, studying the handwriting on the front. It was Robert's, steady and familiar, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards, grocery lists, and every document that had shaped our life together. My name was written there simply. Margaret. No instructions. No explanation. Just my name. I slid my finger beneath the seal and opened it carefully, as if rushing might somehow change what was inside. The paper unfolded with a soft sound, revealing a single page, neatly typed. I read the first line once, then again, making sure I understood it correctly. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to explain things myself. My grip tightened slightly, but I kept reading. The words were clear, direct, exactly as Robert had always been. He explained that over the past few years, he had made certain arrangements, adjustments that he believed were necessary to protect me. He did not mention names, but he did not need to. I could feel the meaning between the lines. He had seen something. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, the same way I was beginning to see it now. There was a list included, short but precise. Bank accounts, a trust, contacts. One name circled at the bottom with a simple note beside it. Call her. She knows everything. I stared at that name for a long moment. It belonged to someone I had not spoken to in years, a woman who had once been Robert's legal advisor before he retired. At the time, I had assumed her role had ended when he stepped away from his business. Now, it seemed that had not been entirely true. I folded the paper slowly, placing it back inside the envelope with a care that felt almost ceremonial. The world outside the car continued moving, people walking past, cars pulling in and out of the lot, life continuing in its steady rhythm. But inside that small space, something had shifted again. This time, it was not loss. It was direction. I reached for my phone and hesitated for just a moment before typing in the number listed on the page. It rang twice before a voice answered, calm and professional, but carrying a note of recognition the moment I introduced myself. Margaret, she said gently. I was wondering when you would call. That single sentence settled something inside me, confirming what I had only begun to suspect. None of this was accidental. None of it had been left to chance. Robert had known. Perhaps not everything, but enough to prepare. Enough to leave me something more than memories and a house that was no longer mine. I think I need your help, I said, my voice steady despite everything that had happened. There was no pity in her response, no hesitation. I have been expecting that, she replied. Do you have time to come by my office today? I looked down at the envelope in my lap, then out at the road ahead of me. For the first time since I had walked out of that house, the answer felt clear. Yes, I said. I do. I started the engine then, the sound grounding me in the present as I pulled out of the parking lot. I did not know exactly what I would find at that office, or how much of my life would change once I walked through those doors. But I knew one thing with certainty. They had thought the story ended when I left that house. They were wrong. It was only just beginning. I arrived at the office just before noon, the building standing tall and quiet among a row of modern glass structures that all looked the same from the outside. It was not a place I would have come to on my own, not without Robert beside me, guiding me through doors like these with his steady confidence. I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, adjusting my coat as if that small gesture could prepare me for whatever waited inside. The lobby was cool and polished, the kind of space where every sound seemed softer, more controlled. A receptionist greeted me with a professional smile and asked for my name. When I told her, she glanced at her screen and nodded immediately, as if my arrival had been expected down to the minute. She is waiting for you, she said, her tone carrying a quiet certainty that made my chest tighten slightly. I followed her directions down a long hallway lined with framed certificates and muted artwork until I reached a door with a simple brass plate bearing a familiar name. I paused before knocking, my hand hovering for just a second, then pressed gently against the wood. Come in, a voice called, calm and steady. The woman who stood to greet me looked almost exactly as I remembered her, though a few more lines had settled around her eyes. She smiled, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. Margaret, she said, stepping forward to shake my hand. I am sorry we are meeting under these circumstances. Her office was warm, filled with shelves of neatly arranged files and a large window that let in soft daylight. I sat across from her desk, placing my purse carefully at my side, the envelope still inside it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no rush in her manner, no pressure to fill the silence. It felt deliberate, like she was giving me space to settle into what was about to unfold. He wanted you to come to me, she said finally, her voice lowering slightly. It was not a question. I nodded. Once, reaching into my purse and placing the folded paper on her desk. She glanced at it briefly, then looked back at me with a quiet understanding that made everything feel more real. Robert was very thorough, she continued. He made sure of that. There was something in the way she said it that shifted the air in the room. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like a door opening slowly. She turned to her desk and pulled out a file, thicker than I expected, placing it in front of her with careful precision. Before I explain anything, she said, I need to ask you something. I met her eyes, steady, prepared. Has anyone contacted you about the estate yet? The question settled heavily between us. I thought about Daniel and Vanessa, about the way they had spoken with such certainty, as if everything had already been decided in their favor. No, I replied. Not yet. She nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something she had already anticipated. Then we have time, she said quietly. Time. It was a word that had felt so limited just days ago, measured in hospital visits and final conversations. Now, it carried a different weight. Possibility. She opened the file and turned it toward me, revealing documents filled with familiar names and unfamiliar details. Your husband created a trust 5 years ago, she explained, her tone measured and clear. It was structured in a way that places you as the primary beneficiary and controlling party. The words did not land all at once. They unfolded slowly, each one settling into place with a clarity that was almost unsettling. Controlling party. I repeated softly, not as a question, but as a way of understanding. She nodded. That means every major asset, including the house, the investment accounts, and several other holdings, are under your authority. I felt something shift inside me again, not shock this time, but recognition. Robert had not just prepared for his absence. He had prepared for this exact moment. There is more, she added, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the file. The trust includes specific conditions regarding inheritance distribution. I looked at her, waiting. Any beneficiary who demonstrates financial exploitation, coercion, or intentional displacement of the primary beneficiary may be subject to immediate removal from the trust. The room felt very still after she said that. Not tense, not heavy, just clear. I thought about the dinner table, about the words that had been spoken so easily, about the certainty in Vanessa's voice and the silence from my son. He knew. I said quietly, more to myself than to her. She did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was calm, almost gentle. He was concerned, she said, and he chose to act on that concern. I sat back in my chair, my hands resting in my lap, steady. The narrative I had been given just days ago, the one where I was a burden, where I needed to step aside, where I no longer belonged, began to dissolve quietly in the face of something far more solid. Not emotion, not opinion, structure, protection, intent. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something else. Something colder, more focused. What happens next? I asked. She closed the file slowly, meeting my gaze without hesitation. That depends, she said, on what you want to do. For a moment, I did not answer her question. Not because I did not understand it, but because I needed to understand myself first. I looked down at my hands, resting quietly in my lap. The same hands that had spent decades building a home, raising a child, supporting a husband who had always seemed so certain about the future. I had never imagined that certainty would one day become mine to carry. I want to see everything, I said finally, my voice calm, steady in a way that surprised even me. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer all along, and reopened the file, this time turning it fully toward me. Page by page, she walked me through it. The house, the one I had been told was no longer mine, was held entirely within the trust. Not partially, not conditionally, entirely. The deed had been transferred years ago, structured in a way that ensured control remained with the trust and, by extension, with me. The investment accounts, the retirement funds, even a portion of Robert's former business interests had all been placed under the same structure. It was not a scattered collection of assets. It was a system, deliberate, layered, protected. I listened carefully, asking questions when I needed to, letting each answer settle before moving on to the next. There was no rush in the room, no pressure to react. Only clarity. They cannot sell the house without your authorization, she said at one point, her tone precise. They cannot access the accounts. They cannot make any legal decisions regarding these assets. I thought about the conversation at the dinner table, about the confidence in Vanessa's voice when she spoke about what I should do, where I should go, what would be best for me. I thought about Daniel's silence, the quiet agreement that had said more than words ever could. They had spoken as if everything was already theirs, as if I was simply an obstacle that needed to be removed. And if they try? I asked. She met my gaze directly. They will be blocked, legally and immediately. There was no emotion in her answer, just fact. It settled into me with a quiet weight that felt different from anything I had experienced in the past few days. Not relief, not satisfaction, something more controlled, more measured. There is one more thing, she added, reaching for a separate document within the file. Your husband included a clause that is specific. I watched as she placed it in front of me, her finger resting lightly on a paragraph near the center of the page. Any individual who attempts to remove you from your residence, manipulate your living conditions, or pressure you into relinquishing control of trust assets may be deemed in violation of the trust's terms. The words were formal, structured in legal language, but their meaning was unmistakable. I read them once, then again, each time with a clearer understanding of what they implied. What happens if that clause is triggered? I asked quietly. She did not hesitate. They forfeit their inheritance rights. Immediately, the room remained still, but something inside me shifted again, aligning pieces that had been scattered just hours before. Robert had not simply protected me from uncertainty. He had anticipated a specific kind of risk, a specific kind of behavior, and he had built a system that responded to it without hesitation. Do they know about this? I asked. She shook her head slightly. Not in detail. They are aware of the trust's existence, but not its conditions. Your husband was very clear about that. I let that settle. The knowledge sat quietly between us, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful in its simplicity. They believed they were in control. They believed the outcome was already decided, and they had acted accordingly. There will be a formal inheritance meeting in a few days, she continued, her tone shifting slightly towards something more strategic. They will expect to discuss distribution, access, next steps. That is when this becomes relevant. I looked at the documents in front of me, then back at her. You mean that is when they will find out? She gave a small, measured nod. Yes. I sat back in my chair, my posture straight, my hands still calm in my lap. For the first time since everything began, I could see the shape of what was coming next. Not as a reaction, not as something I needed to survive, but as something I could choose. I do not want to rush anything, I said carefully. I want them to speak first. She watched me for a moment, then allowed a faint, almost approving expression to appear. That would be effective, she said. I nodded once, slowly. I was not thinking about revenge, not in the way people often imagine it. I was thinking about truth, about letting it reveal itself fully, without interruption, without warning. They had already shown me who they were when they believed I had nothing. Now, they would show me everything when they believed they had won. And this time, I would be ready. The rest of that day moved quietly, almost too quietly, as if the world had softened its edges just enough to give me space to think. I left the office with the documents carefully placed in my bag, each page carrying more weight than anything I had held in years. The drive away from the building felt different from the one that brought me there. Not because the roads had changed, but because I had. I was no longer moving without direction. I was moving with purpose, even if I had not yet decided exactly how I would use it. I checked into a small hotel just outside the city, the kind of place that did not ask too many questions and did not offer too many comforts either. It was clean, quiet, and temporary. That was all I needed. The room was simple, a bed, a small desk, a window overlooking a parking lot that was nearly empty by late afternoon. I set my suitcase down near the wall and placed my bag on the desk, taking out the documents one by one and arranging them neatly in front of me. I did not rush through them. I read slowly, carefully, making sure I understood every detail. Numbers, names, conditions, clauses. Each line reinforced the same truth. I had not been pushed out. I had been tested. Or perhaps more accurately, they had tested themselves, revealing exactly who they were when they believed I no longer mattered. As the sun lowered outside, casting long shadows across the room. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Memories surfaced, not in a rush, but in a steady sequence. Daniel as a child, running through the backyard with scraped knees and bright laughter. Daniel as a young man, nervous before his first job interview, asking for advice he trusted me to give. And then Daniel at the dinner table, unable to look at me while his wife told me to leave my own home. The contrast was not sharp or dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, the kind of change that happens so slowly you do not notice it until it is complete. I opened my eyes and looked back down at the documents. There was no anger in me, not the kind that burns or demands immediate action. What I felt was something steadier, a recognition of reality, stripped of expectation. They had made their choices. Now I would make mine. My phone remained silent for most of the evening. No calls, no messages. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. They were not concerned about where I was. They were not wondering if I was safe. They believed the situation had resolved itself in their favor. That belief would remain intact for now. I picked up the phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping when I reached Daniel's name. My thumb hovered over it for a moment before I set the phone back down. There would be time for conversations later. For now, silence served me better. The following morning, I woke early, before the sun had fully risen. The room was still, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were simple but deliberate, the same way I used to prepare for important days in the past. Not to impress anyone, but to remind myself that I was still in control of how I presented myself to the world. I gathered the documents and placed them back into my bag, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. There was a certain clarity in small acts of organization, a sense of order that carried into everything else. Later that day, my phone finally rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, the first contact since I had walked out of that house. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a forced lightness that felt unfamiliar. "We were wondering where you went. Vanessa thought maybe you were staying with a friend." I listened without interrupting, noting the phrasing, the assumptions built into his words. Not concern, not apology, just curiosity shaped by convenience. "I am fine," I replied calmly. "I have made arrangements." There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had expected more. "Good," he said finally. "That is good. We did not want you to feel uncomfortable." The words settled strangely between us. Uncomfortable, as if that had been the issue. As if I had simply needed a different place to stay, rather than being told I no longer belonged. "There is going to be a meeting in a few days," he continued, his tone shifting slightly. "About Dad's estate. The lawyer said we should all be there." I looked out the window, watching the empty parking lot as the early light began to fill the space. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am aware." "So you will come?" he asked. I allowed a small pause before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. "Of course," I said. I would not miss it. The next 2 days passed with a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar, as if I had stepped into a version of my life where every movement was deliberate, every decision measured. I did not return to the house. I did not call Daniel back. I allowed the silence to remain exactly where it was, because for once, it was working in my favor. Each morning, I reviewed the documents again, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to understand them completely. There was a difference between knowing something and owning it, and I intended to do both. I traced every clause, every condition, every line that Robert had put in place. It was not just protection. It was strategy. He had not left anything to chance, and now, neither would I. On the second afternoon, I met with the attorney again. This time, the conversation was less about discovery and more about preparation. She walked me through the structure of the upcoming meeting, explaining who would be present, how the discussion would likely unfold, and where the points of tension might arise. "They will assume they are in control," she said calmly, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "That assumption will guide everything they say." I nodded once, already understanding the weight of that. "And I should let them," I replied. She gave a small, approving look, not of encouragement, but of recognition. "Yes," she said. "It is always more revealing when people believe they are unchallenged." We discussed timing, language, and the importance of restraint. Not silence, but control. She advised me not to interrupt, not to correct, not to reveal anything prematurely. The more they speak, the clearer the situation becomes, she explained. For everyone in the room. I understood what she meant. This was not about confrontation. It was about exposure. That evening, back in the hotel, I stood by the window for a long time, watching as the parking lot lights flickered on one by one. The sky darkened slowly, the transition almost unnoticeable if you were not paying attention. It reminded me of everything that had led to this moment. Nothing had happened all at once. It had been gradual. A shift here, a decision there, a silence that replaced what used to be conversation. And now, the result was clear. I turned away from the window and sat at the desk, opening my bag one last time. I did not need to read the documents again. I simply placed them in order, aligning the edges carefully, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. There was a certain calm in that, a quiet assurance that I was ready. The morning of the meeting arrived without urgency. I woke before my alarm, the same way I always had on important days, my mind already clear before my feet touched the floor. I dressed slowly, choosing a soft gray coat and a simple blouse, nothing that called attention, but nothing that diminished my presence either. I brushed my hair, adjusted the collar, and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had walked out of that house with a single suitcase. She was steadier, sharper, not because something had been added, but because something had been removed. Doubt. I left the hotel just after 8, giving myself more than enough time to arrive early. The drive was quiet, the roads still lightly populated, the city just beginning to wake. When I reached the building, I parked a short distance away and sat in the car for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only awareness. I stepped out, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the entrance with measured steps. Inside, the atmosphere was already different from my previous visit. More movement, more voices, people gathering, preparing, anticipating. I recognized Daniel immediately when I entered the main conference area. He was standing near the far end of the room, speaking quietly with Vanessa, both of them dressed with a formality that suggested confidence rather than respect. When he saw me, his expression shifted briefly, not to relief, but to something more controlled, more cautious. Vanessa's reaction was subtler. Her eyes moved over me once, assessing, then returned to whatever she had been saying, as if my presence did not alter her expectations. I did not approach them. I did not speak. Instead, I walked to the opposite side of the room and took a seat, placing my bag neatly beside me. From where I sat, I could observe everything without being part of it. Their posture, their expressions, the way they interacted with the others arriving one by one. They were comfortable, certain, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. And for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself a small, quiet thought. Let them speak. The room settled into a quiet order as more people took their seats, the low hum of conversation gradually fading into something more formal, more controlled. Papers were arranged, chairs adjusted, brief nods exchanged between individuals who all believed they understood the purpose of the meeting. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my gaze steady but unintrusive. From where I sat, I could see Daniel and Vanessa clearly. They had positioned themselves near the center of the table, not at the head, but close enough to suggest authority. It was a small detail, but one that revealed more than words ever could. They were not waiting to be told what would happen. They were expecting to confirm what they already believed was theirs. The attorney entered a few moments later, carrying a folder similar in weight and structure to the one I had reviewed the day before. Her presence shifted the atmosphere immediately. Conversation stopped. Posture straightened. The room moved from assumption to attention. She greeted everyone with a calm professionalism, then took her place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice even measured. "We are here to review the structure and distribution of Robert Collins' estate." I watched as Daniel leaned slightly forward, his expression composed, prepared. Vanessa sat beside him, her posture relaxed, almost confident, her hands folded neatly in front of her. They exchanged a brief glance, subtle but unmistakable. A shared understanding, a shared expectation. The attorney continued, outlining the general structure first, speaking in broad terms that gave nothing away too quickly. She explained the existence of the trust, the timeline of its creation, and the intention behind its design. I noticed the slight shift in Vanessa's expression at the mention of a trust. Not concern. Not yet. Just a moment of recalibration, as if adjusting to information that was more complex than anticipated. Daniel remained focused, nodding occasionally, his attention fixed on the attorney as she spoke. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, though it arrived without any dramatic pause or shift in tone. The trust designates a primary beneficiary and controlling party, she said, her voice unchanged, her delivery precise. All major assets, including the primary residence, are held under this structure. I felt the room tighten slightly, not visibly, but in the way people leaned in just a fraction more, listening more closely. Vanessa's posture straightened. Daniel's expression sharpened. They were no longer simply confirming expectations. They were listening for something specific, something they believed would be said next. The attorney allowed a brief pause, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for anticipation to settle. Then she continued. The primary beneficiary and controlling party is Margaret Collins. The words landed quietly, without emphasis, without dramatic inflection. But their impact was immediate. Daniel's head turned toward me, his expression shifting in a way I had not seen before. Not anger. Not yet. Confusion. Vanessa's reaction was more controlled, but her hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, tightened slightly, her fingers pressing together as if holding something in place. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply met Daniel's gaze for a brief moment, then looked back toward the attorney, allowing the silence to remain exactly as it was. This designation grants full authority over all trust assets. The attorney continued, her tone steady, unaffected by the change in the room. No decisions regarding the property, accounts, or investments can be made without her explicit approval. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible now, in the way Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture losing its earlier confidence, in the way Vanessa's eyes moved quickly between the attorney and the documents in front of her, searching for something that would restore the narrative she had been holding on to. That does not make sense, Vanessa said finally, her voice controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before. We were told that the estate would be handled jointly. The attorney turned her gaze toward her, calm, unhurried. You were informed that there would be a review, she replied. The structure itself has been in place for several years. I watched as Vanessa processed that, her expression tightening slightly, the confidence that had filled the room earlier beginning to fracture, not dramatically, but steadily. Daniel remained silent, his gaze shifting back to me, searching for something he could not yet define. I offered him nothing. No reassurance. No explanation. Only the same calm presence I had carried into the room. The attorney continued, turning a page in the document. There are also specific conditions attached to the distribution of inheritance, she said, her voice remaining even, precise. These conditions address the conduct of beneficiaries in relation to the primary party. The air in the room changed again, not louder, not more tense, but sharper, as if every word that followed would matter more than the last. And for the first time since the meeting began, I could see it clearly. The moment where assumption gives way to reality. The moment where everything they believed begins to shift. I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands still, my voice absent. Because this was never going to be about what I said. It was about what they had already done. The attorney did not rush the next part. She allowed the silence to settle, to stretch just long enough for the weight of what had already been said to fully land. Then, with the same calm precision, she turned another page and continued. The trust includes a conduct clause, she said, her voice steady, her eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to the document. This clause is designed to protect the primary beneficiary from coercion, displacement, or any attempt to remove her from her established residence or financial control. I watched as Daniel's expression shifted again, this time more visibly. The confusion had not disappeared, but something else had begun to surface beneath it. Awareness. Vanessa, on the other hand, remained composed on the outside, but the tension in her posture had become unmistakable. Her shoulders were slightly higher, her movements more controlled, as if she were holding something back. Any such actions, the attorney continued, if demonstrated or verified, result in immediate disqualification from inheritance under the trust. The words were delivered without emphasis, but their effect was immediate. The room did not react loudly. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements. But the stillness deepened, sharpened. Daniel's gaze moved from the attorney to me, then back again, as if trying to align what he was hearing with what he thought he knew. Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her voice controlled but no longer smooth. "What exactly qualifies as displacement?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. The attorney met her question without hesitation. "Forcing or instructing the primary beneficiary to vacate her residence without her consent," she replied. "Applying pressure to alter her living situation for personal gain. Any coordinated effort that results in her removal from her home environment." The clarity of the answer left very little room for interpretation. I did not need to look at them to know what they were thinking. The dinner table. The words that had been spoken so casually. The assumption that I would simply accept it and leave. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand moving to the edge of the table as if grounding himself. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice lower now, less certain. "We were just trying to help. The house is too large. We thought it would be better for her to." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The explanation sounded incomplete even as he spoke it. Vanessa turned toward him briefly, then back to the attorney. "There was no intention to remove anyone," she added, her tone controlled but tighter than before. "We were discussing options." The attorney listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged. When they finished, she simply nodded once and looked back down at the document. "Intent is considered," she said calmly. "But actions and outcomes carry greater weight." The room returned to silence again, but this time it was different. Not expectant, not neutral. It was the kind of silence that follows realization. I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my hand still resting lightly in my lap. I did not feel the need to respond, to defend, or to clarify. Everything that needed to be said was already being said, line by line, clause by clause. Based on the structure of the trust, the attorney continued, "The primary beneficiary retains full authority to determine whether any violation has occurred and how to proceed with enforcement." That was the first time the focus shifted directly toward me in a way that required acknowledgement. Not pressure, not expectation, just recognition. Daniel looked at me again, this time with something closer to uncertainty than confusion. "Mom," he said, his voice softer now, as if searching for a version of me that would make this easier. "We did not mean to." I met his gaze briefly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something steadier. Something that did not need to be explained. Then I looked back toward the attorney. "I understand the terms," I said quietly. My voice was calm, even, carrying no more weight than necessary, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that I was no longer outside the conversation. Enough to establish that I had heard everything and that I understood it fully. The attorney nodded once, acknowledging my response without adding anything further. "Then the next step is yours," she said. I let a small pause settle before speaking again, not because I needed time to decide, but because I wanted the moment to be clear, deliberate. "No decisions need to be made today," I said calmly. "I will review everything carefully before determining how to proceed." It was not a refusal, not a concession. It was control. And for the first time since the meeting began, the balance in the room shifted completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Daniel leaned back slightly, his earlier certainty gone. Vanessa remained still, her composure intact but thinner now, as if it required more effort to maintain. The conversation continued after that, but the structure had already changed. The outcome was no longer assumed. It was waiting on me. And as I sat there, listening without reacting, observing without interrupting, I realized something simple and absolute. They had already made their move when they believed I had nothing. Now it was my turn, and I did not need to rush.